Hello everyone. Before we start, hit that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is for you. That's how YouTube keeps sending you stories like this. And now, let's get into it. When I think back to that night, what always hits me first is how normal it began. I was 20 years old, restless, and too full of myself for my own good. I had been going to college in the North Georgia mountains, tucked between small towns and long stretches of dark forests. Night hiking was something my friends and I did often. It made us feel fearless, like the woods were ours. Over time I got so used to the trails, the darkness, the quiet, that I stopped thinking anything bad could ever happen out there. I had walked those paths under cloudy skies, in rain and cold, with nothing but a weak flashlight and the stupid confidence of someone who thought they understood the world, just because they had walked through it a few times. That night was brighter than usual. There was a full moon, and the air was cool and clean, not too windy, not too humid. The world felt open instead of closed. The moon washed the trail and the trees in a soft blue glow that made everything look like a faded photograph. I had smoked a little earlier in the evening, enough to be relaxed but not enough to feel clumsy or disconnected. I liked that feeling of smooth calm, the sense that my mind was loosened just enough for the world to feel interesting. I remember grabbing my flashlight out of habit, even though I didn't think I would need it. This was in 2002, so I didn't have a cell phone with me. It was just me, my flashlight, and the open trail. I chose an easy loop I had done more times than I could count. It was mostly flat, maybe a mile long, and tucked away from any real activity. It wasn't a popular hiking area, just a spot rural folks knew about, a place students wandered into when they wanted peace or something to do. The first few minutes of the hike were peaceful in a way that still feels warm when I think about it. The trees were tall and thin, and the moonlight came through them like a soft, cold mist. The ground was dry and firm. I could smell pine and the faint sweetness of leaves breaking down under the soil. I could walk without thinking. I didn't even use my flashlight. I felt like I could see everything well enough on my own. I remember being amazed at how sharp everything looked. Every shadow had an edge. Every rock had shape and detail. I could see individual branches stretching above me like the inside of some giant rib cage. The quiet was thick, but not empty. I could hear insects hidden in the grass, the faint rustle of leaves far off, the soft crunch under my boots. I felt alone, but in a way that felt right. Somewhere around the halfway point, something shifted. It didn't happen suddenly. It was more like a slow, cold wave sliding through my body. 1 second I felt calm, and the next something inside me tightened. My stomach felt hollow and tense. My skin felt prickly. It felt like the air had changed around me, like the temperature dropped even though it didn't. There was no sound to trigger it, no movement I noticed, just a sudden deep warning in my body that something was wrong. I slowed down and stood still, listening. The woods around me looked the same as they had a moment before. The light was the same. The trail was the same. But I felt something I still can't explain. It was the kind of feeling you get when you walk into a room and immediately know someone has been crying or fighting, even if everything looks fine. A pressure in the air, and then I heard him. The sound came from ahead of me, but not directly on the trail. It came from the right side, somewhere deeper in the trees. A man's voice. At first it was faint, just a soft noise that my brain couldn't place. Then it grew clearer, like my ears were adjusting to it. He was crying. Not just normal crying. It was the kind of crying that comes from someone who has been breaking down for hours. Long, pulled apart sobs, like he couldn't breathe right. There was a roughness to it, like his throat was raw. Under the crying there was this strange, almost babbling sound. Not words. Not even sounds that made sense. It was like he was mumbling to himself in broken pieces, almost like a child talking nonsense through tears. Every now and then the crying would rise into something sharp, like he was right on the edge of screaming but holding it back. I froze. Every part of me wanted to help, because that's who I was then. If someone was upset, I always felt pulled toward them. But something about this wasn't right. The moment I heard him clearly, my stomach twisted so hard I thought I might throw up. My chest felt tight. I felt this deep instinct telling me not to speak, not to move, not to let him know I was there. My mind tried to tell me he was hurt, or drunk, or grieving. But my body had already made the decision for me. I could not call out to him. My throat wouldn't even let me try. I felt like if I made one sound, if I stepped on one branch, if I breathed too hard, whatever was happening in those trees would turn toward me. So I backed away, very slowly. I didn't turn around at first. I stepped backward, keeping my eyes on the trail, the trees, the direction of the crying. Every time a leaf rustled under my boot, my whole body clenched. The crying didn't stop, but it didn't change either. It kept going, this horrible broken rhythm, like he was trapped in whatever feeling had destroyed him. Eventually I turned and walked the way I had come. I tried not to rush. I tried to keep my breathing slow. But my mind felt like it was shrinking, like all my senses were pulling inward into this tight tunnel. All I could hear was that crying behind me. Even when it became faint, even when I knew logically I was getting farther from it, it felt like it was right behind my ears. I didn't use my flashlight. I didn't dare. I remember thinking so clearly that if I turned it on, the beam would give away my position like a flare. The moonlight had been comforting minutes earlier, but now it felt like it was exposing me. I walked carefully, listening, waiting for the crying to rise, for footsteps, for anything. Slowly it faded. The sobs softened until they were part of the air. Then they became nothing at all. But I still didn't feel safe. I didn't feel safe until I saw the faint shape of the trailhead sign through the trees. Even then my hands were shaking. My breathing was uneven. I kept expecting someone to rush out at me, some wild, desperate figure with a torn shirt and wide eyes, chasing me down the last stretch of dirt. When I reached my car, I almost dropped my keys. I locked the doors so fast my hand slammed the button. Only when I heard the click did something inside me release. My whole body started shaking. Not a small tremble, real shaking. Like everything that had locked itself tight inside me suddenly spilled out at once. I drove back to campus in silence, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles hurt. Every shadow on the road made my heart jump. Every curve of the headlights against the trees made me think someone was stepping out. When I finally parked, I just sat there. I didn't get out. I didn't turn off the engine. I sat with the doors locked, shaking, breathing like I had run miles. It took a long time before I could move again. I never told anyone the full story back then. I didn't feel embarrassed, but I also didn't know how to explain it without sounding dramatic. But the truth is simple. I believe I was in real danger that night. I believe that if I had spoken, or used my flashlight, or walked forward instead of turning back, something terrible would have happened. Not supernatural, not a ghost or a monster. Just a real man in a dark forest, crying like he had lost his mind. And the sick feeling I had, that instant warning, has never left me. Sometimes I still think about how bright the moon was that night, how it let me turn my light off completely. I think about how close I came to breaking that silence. I think about how different it might have been if the night had been darker, if I had taken one careless step, if the man had sensed me before I sensed him. The woods can feel peaceful, even beautiful. But they can also hold things you're not meant to walk into. That night taught me the difference, and I've never hiked alone at night again. I still think about that evening sometimes, usually when I'm tired or running late, and I catch myself remembering how fast daylight disappears in the redwoods. Back when I was at UC Santa Cruz, running was the one thing that kept me sane. The campus sits in the middle of a massive forest of redwoods, with trails that loop and twist for miles. You can step off a paved path between lecture halls and suddenly feel like you're in a national park. I ran almost every day, and I knew many of the trails well enough that I didn't even think about getting lost. The trees, the soft ground, the smell of the woods. Those things became part of my routine. I got comfortable, maybe too comfortable, because the isolation of those trails isn't something you take seriously until the day something happens that forces you to rethink everything. That day I had a late class and ended up heading out much later than I normally did. I still thought I had time to make it to my usual turnaround point before the sun set. It was one of the more isolated trails, a narrow dirt path that cut deep into the woods, far enough that there were long stretches where you couldn't hear anything but your own footsteps. On most days I would pass a few hikers or other runners, but that day it was just quiet. The air felt heavy and still, like the forest had settled in for the night long, before I realized how late it actually was. I remember thinking the trail looked darker than usual. The trees pressed in on both sides, the last of the sunlight barely reaching the ground. About 15 minutes in, I finally saw someone ahead of me on the trail. At first I thought it might be another student heading back toward campus, but the shape didn't look right. As I got closer, I could tell it was a man walking deeper into the woods. His clothes looked ragged and dirty, hanging off him like he had been wearing the same layers for days. His hair was long and tangled. His posture had a strange stiffness to it, like he was dragging himself forward, rather than walking with a normal rhythm. Something about the way he moved immediately made me alert. Most people out there either walked with purpose or moved out of the way when runners passed. But this guy didn't react at all until I was almost right behind him. I slowed down because I didn't want to come up on him too fast. I kept a wide distance as I passed, my eyes fixed forward, pretending not to notice anything unusual, even though my entire body was tense. The woods were getting darker, and I had a bad feeling about the idea of this man spending the night out there. The trail went deep, too deep for someone to just wander without knowing where they were going. People camped illegally sometimes, but there were easier places to hide than that stretch of trail. Something about it felt off, like he wasn't just a homeless man, but someone who had been living in the woods long enough to lose track of everything else. Once I passed him, I heard him say something behind me. His voice was rough and thin, the kind of voice that comes from someone who talks mostly to himself. Even without turning around, I could tell he was unstable. The sound of his mumbling went on for several seconds as I jogged forward, and even though I couldn't make out the words, there was something uneasy in the tone. I didn't speed up too much, because I didn't want to draw more attention to myself. But every instinct I had was telling me to get away from him. I tried to shake it off and finish the run so I could head back before it got completely dark. The redwoods do this thing where everything goes dim earlier than you expect, because the canopy is so thick that once the sun drops even a little, the ground level light just vanishes. By the time I reached my checkpoint, the trail had already faded into that bluish dusk that makes it hard to see anything far ahead. I stood there for a moment, trying to calm myself before heading back. The idea of passing that man again made my stomach twist, but I didn't have any other option, unless I wanted to take one of the unmarked side paths, which I never used because they were overgrown and easy to get lost in. The run back felt different. The quiet that had seemed peaceful earlier now felt heavy and tense. Every sound seemed too sharp or too close. The crunch of leaves, the snap of a twig, the rustle of branches shifting in the breeze. I kept expecting to see him around every turn, but the trail stayed empty. When I reached the spot where I had first passed him, I slowed down and scanned the area carefully. Nothing. No movement, no shadow. No sign that anyone had walked back in the direction of campus. There were no side trails branching off, no clearings where someone could just disappear. The only explanation was that he had gone off the trail into the trees. That thought messed with me more than seeing him the first time. The woods off the main trail were a maze of undergrowth, fallen logs, uneven ground, and thick shadows. You could walk 5 feet in and disappear from sight. The idea of someone unstable wandering around out there in the dark made me feel exposed. I kept running, trying to act like I didn't care, but my heart was pounding hard enough that I could feel it in my throat. Not long after I passed that spot, something made me stop. It wasn't a sound at first. It was this feeling that someone was watching me, like eyes were on me from somewhere above or behind. I tried to brush it off as me being paranoid, but then I heard something from the hillside to my right. It wasn't a clear sound, just movement. I looked up, but the slope was steep and covered in dark shapes of trees and brush. It was almost impossible to see anything. Then I heard a voice from somewhere up the hill, not loud, but sharp enough to make me stop dead. It sounded strained, scared. My first thought was that it might be another runner or hiker who had hurt themselves. But the fear in the sound made me panic more than anything. I stared up into the trees, trying to spot where it came from. The hillside was so steep that climbing it would take real effort, which made me wonder why anyone would be up there, unless they were running from something. After a few moments, I finally saw movement. A figure was coming down the slope toward me, slipping and grabbing at branches to keep from falling. It was a girl, probably around my age, breathing hard and covered in dirt and needles. She looked like she had been hiding up there for a while. She was wide-eyed and shaking, and even before she reached the trail, I understood that something bad had happened to her. She explained, in short, panicked bursts, that she'd been running earlier and had encountered the same man. He had followed her, getting closer and more aggressive, until she panicked and scrambled up the hillside to get away. She said she stayed up there because she didn't know where he went, and she was too scared to come back down. Hearing that confirmed everything I had been trying to push out of my mind. It wasn't just that the man was strange. He was unpredictable and possibly dangerous. And he was somewhere in the dark woods around us, either watching or wandering, maybe listening, maybe waiting. The entire area suddenly felt unsafe. Every direction felt like a place where he could appear. The girl looked like she was on the edge of breaking down, and truthfully, I wasn't far behind her. We both needed to get back to the road, and the only way out was straight down the trail, the same direction the man had been walking earlier. We ran together, not fast, but with that tense energy where every sound makes you jerk your head. The forest was almost completely dark now. With 2 of us moving, the noise we made felt too loud, echoing off the trees, making it impossible to tell if someone else was moving nearby. Every few seconds I glanced behind us. The girl kept doing the same. Neither of us saw anything, but it didn't matter. The fear stayed right behind us, close enough that we couldn't let our guard drop. The trail seemed longer on the way out than it ever had before. My legs were burning and my breathing was uneven, but I didn't want to stop. The girl stayed right beside me. I could tell she was exhausted, but she kept going. When we finally saw the faint gray strip of the road through the trees, something in me loosened. Not relief exactly, but the tightness in my chest eased just enough that I could breathe normally again. Once we reached the road, we stopped under one of the streetlights. The glow felt unreal after so long in the dark woods. Cars passed occasionally, and the sound of them gave me a sense of safety. The girl thanked me before heading in the direction of her dorm. I watched her go until she turned a corner and disappeared. Then I stood there alone for a moment, letting the adrenaline drain out of my body. My hands were shaking without me realizing it. The forest behind me felt like a wall of black, full of places someone could stand and watch without being seen. I walked back to my place instead of running. The whole time, I kept imagining footsteps behind me, even though I didn't hear anything. When I got home, I locked the door and sat down on the floor, because my legs felt weak. I didn't go back to that trail after that. I switched to the busier ones, even if they were less peaceful. Peace wasn't really something I associated with the woods anymore. I never found out who that man was. UC Santa Cruz has all kinds of stories about people disappearing into the forest after flunking out or dropping out, choosing to live off grid in the redwoods. Some people said it was just rumors. Others said it happened more often than anyone admitted. All I know is that whoever he wasn't just someone passing through. He knew those woods well enough to vanish without a sound. He knew where to step, where to hide, where to move so quietly that two people could run right past him and never know he was only a few yards away. Even now when I think about it, what scares me most isn't what he did, but what he might have done if I had run a little slower, or if the girl hadn't climbed up that hill, or if either of us had been alone on the way back. The forest is beautiful, but it only takes one wrong moment to show you how quickly it can turn into something else. I learned that lesson the hard way, and it stayed with me long after I left Santa Cruz. I still run, but I don't go into isolated trails at dusk anymore. I don't ignore the feeling when something isn't right, because that night taught me that sometimes danger isn't loud or obvious. Sometimes it's just a quiet figure in the trees. Someone who shouldn't be there. Someone who disappears into the dark without leaving a trace, except the fear you carry with you afterward. I still think about that evening more than I should. Sometimes it comes back to me when I'm driving on an empty road at dusk, or when I'm hiking with no one around, and the wind moving through the trees sounds too much like footsteps. It wasn't the scariest moment of my life in the dramatic sense, but it was the most unsettling, the kind of fear that settles deep in your ribs and never fully leaves. It was supposed to be an easy afternoon trip, something simple to break up the routine of the week. My girlfriend and I had been trying to find new places to explore, not crowded state parks or marked trails, but the old forgotten forest roads that looked like they hadn't been used in years. This one seemed perfect. It ran along a big, calm lake on one side and the dark slopes of mountains on the other. The weather was cool enough to be comfortable, but warm enough that we didn't need jackets. The air smelled like pine sap and dust, and that faint lake smell that sits low in the air when the sun is dropping. The dirt road started off rough but manageable, just loose gravel and potholes that made the car rumble. After about 15 minutes, the potholes got deeper, long ruts cut through the road like old scars, and branches hung low enough that they scraped across the roof. The farther we drove, the more it felt like the forest was swallowing the road, like it had been years since anyone bothered coming this way. There were no pull-offs, no tire tracks except our own, no signs, not even old fences or posts. Just empty woods pressing in on both sides. After a few more minutes, the road narrowed down so much that the bushes brushed both doors at the same time, and then the trees closed in the rest of the way until the car couldn't go forward anymore. Ahead of us, the road was just a mess of fallen limbs, thick brush, and tall grass. It looked like the forest had grown over the whole thing and locked it shut. We got out and stretched, and for a while the silence felt nice. The lake wasn't visible anymore, but we could hear it in the distance, a soft rushing sound every time the breeze pushed across the surface. Birds were chirping high up in the canopy, and the shade under the trees was cool and deep. We decided to hike a while since we had come all this way. The light through the branches was soft and warm, turning everything a kind of pale gold. It felt peaceful, like a place people had forgotten but nature hadn't. The path was barely a path, more like a faint impression of where the road had once been, but it was enough to follow. We walked for what felt like an hour, maybe more. Neither of us checked the time, because we weren't paying attention to anything except the woods and the sound of our own footsteps. Eventually, though, the shadows began stretching long across the ground, and the air started cooling off in that slow, sinking way it always does when the sun starts dipping behind mountains. We decided to head back before it got dark enough to make walking difficult. When we reached the car, the sun had dropped low enough that only a sliver of orange light touched the tops of the trees. Turning the car around took forever because the space was so tight. I had to inch forward a foot, reverse a foot, turn the wheel, do it again, over and over, while the forest pressed in on both sides like it was waiting for us to mess up. Finally, we got it turned around. It felt like a relief, like once the headlights were facing back down the path, we'd be able to leave that heavy quiet behind. The drive out was slow. The road was even worse going the opposite direction. Every rut deeper, every branch lower. Shadows moved across the ground in long strips as the headlights bounced. The forest felt different on the way back, quieter in a sharper way. I kept expecting an animal to run out in front of the car, a deer or raccoon, something startled by the light. But nothing crossed the path. We hadn't seen another person all day, and we both knew we wouldn't see anyone on the way out either. Then we reached the fork. Earlier, driving in, it hadn't been visible at all. Maybe the light had been hitting differently, or maybe the brush hit it from the angle we came. But now, in the fading light, it was there, 2 directions instead of 1. Both narrow, both rough, both looking equally unused. I stopped the car for a second, but there was no sign of which one was right. No tire marks. No broken branches to show which direction we'd come from. I picked one at random because sitting there and thinking about it wasn't going to help. The forest was getting darker by the minute. The choice felt wrong almost immediately. Not because of anything obvious, but because the air felt heavier, like the temperature dropped a little. The trees leaned in closer, making the headlights feel too dim. The road curved tight around a cluster of thick bushes, and as we came around that bend, the headlights caught something on the trail ahead. A man. He was dragging a huge hockey-style duffel bag, long and heavy looking. The kind that could fit a whole person curled up inside. He was pulling it off the path and into the brush, like he didn't want it on the road anymore. As soon as the lights hit him, he froze, completely. Not even a twitch, just stopped with his hands still gripping the straps, his body hunched like he had been mid-pull when he suddenly turned to stone. I kept driving because I had to. The road was far too narrow to stop or turn around, and reversing in that darkness felt impossible. The car crawled forward at barely 5 miles an hour while we passed him. It felt like it took a full minute to move 10 feet. The whole time the headlights stayed on him, then the side window slid past him, then the rear window, and he still didn't move. Not his head, not his arms, nothing. Like he was waiting. When we finally passed far enough that the darkness swallowed him again, I felt my stomach tighten. The forest was completely quiet. Not a bird, not an insect, nothing. And then the road ended. Just stopped dead again, swallowed up by brush and fallen trees, the same way the original road had ended before we hiked. We hadn't taken the right fork. There was no way forward. The thought of turning around and driving back past that man made my hands shake. There was no avoiding it. That was the only way out. I turned the wheel slowly, praying I wouldn't get stuck or slide into a ditch. The forest felt like it was pressing in harder than before. Every shadow thicker, every sound sharper. We drove back toward where we had seen him. But he wasn't there. The spot where he had been dragging that bag was empty. No sign of him. No sign of the bag. The brush on the side of the road didn't look disturbed, like nothing had been dragged through it at all. The ground had no marks. It was like he had just vanished into the trees. I drove faster after that, faster than was safe on a road like that. Branches slapped the sides of the car, the tires skidded in loose dirt, but I didn't care. I just needed to get out of there and find the original road before the last of the daylight was gone. The forest felt alive around us, not in the natural way, but in the way that makes you feel watched, like something is matching the speed of your heartbeat. After what felt like too long, the fork came back into view. This time I took the other direction, the one that must have been the original. The road widened a little, the brush thinned out, and the faint sound of the lake returned. Eventually, the forest opened just enough to let a bit of leftover light spill in, and we knew we were on the right path. When the road finally smoothed out, and the lake appeared beside us again, it felt like stepping out of a nightmare into cold, but familiar air. We made it back to the main road without seeing anyone else. No cars, no hikers, nothing. Just empty forest, empty sky, and the last thin stretch of daylight disappearing over the water. The strangest part wasn't even the man himself, or the way he froze like an animal caught in headlights. It was the fact that there was no vehicle anywhere. No tire tracks besides ours. No pull-off areas for miles in either direction. We had driven as far as possible on both ends of that road. There was nowhere he could have parked. Nowhere he could have come from. And no reason for someone to drag a heavy bag into the forest that late in the day. That far from anything, with no way to leave quickly. I've thought about it a lot since then. If he was hiking, the bag was too heavy. If he was camping, he had no gear except the bag. If he had walked in from somewhere, he would have passed us earlier, and we would have seen him. If he was hauling trash, it didn't look like trash. The shape was wrong. The way he dragged it was wrong. The weight looked wrong. Whatever was in that bag wasn't something a normal person carries into the woods 50 miles from the nearest town. And whatever he was doing out there, he didn't want witnesses. When we drove past him, and he froze like that, it wasn't the reaction of someone startled. It was the reaction of someone calculating. Someone deciding what to do about the people who suddenly saw something they weren't meant to see. The moment we passed him the first time, I knew we were not supposed to be on that road. But the moment we came back and he was gone, leaving no signs of where he went, or how he disappeared so fast with something so heavy, that was when the fear actually hit me. Not the sharp kind of fear that comes from danger in front of you, but the deeper kind that sits in the back of your mind and whispers every time you remember a detail. We never found out who he was. We never found out what was in the bag. We never found an explanation that made sense. And every now and then, when I think about that empty road and the way he froze under the headlights, I realize something that chills me more each time. A person doesn't drag something heavy, that deep into the woods, unless they're planning to leave it there forever. And they don't freeze like that, unless they're deciding whether to stop you from leaving too. I remember the night clearly, even though it happened years ago. I had gone out for a walk around my neighborhood, just me and the night air, the stars sharp and cold above me. It was one of those nights where the silence feels heavier than the wind, and every little sound seems like it might be something dangerous. My neighborhood isn't huge, but there's this small pond a few streets over, tucked behind a cluster of trees. It wasn't big, just a little oval of water, but there was a bench right near the edge and a rope swing hanging out over the water. I liked it because it felt isolated but safe enough. At least that's what I told myself. I decided to sit on the bench and stare at the stars. The water was dark and still, the surface broken only by the occasional ripple from a passing frog or a light wind. The air smelled damp and earthy, the kind of smell that makes you feel a little more alive, more aware. After a few minutes of watching the sky, I heard a soft rustling to my right, coming from the wooded area just beyond the bench. Bears were not uncommon around where I live. I've seen them before on hikes, and once near a trail outside the city limits. I didn't panic, but I felt my stomach tighten. I fumbled for my flashlight, hands shaking slightly, and swept the beam slowly across the trees. Nothing. Just shadows stretching and twisting in the dim light, branches swaying gently. I stayed still on the bench, keeping the light on and my ears straining for any other sound. The rustling stopped after a few seconds, but my chest was tight, my pulse fast. I tried to calm myself. I leaned back into the bench, the wood cold against my back, and let the flashlight rest across my lap. The sky stretched above me, endless and quiet, and for a moment I thought, maybe it was just a deer or a raccoon moving through the underbrush. Maybe I was overthinking it. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it again. A subtle movement in the branches above the tree line. A branch twitched, and a faint scrape of leaves whispered through the air. I froze, my stomach lurched. I didn't shine the light yet, didn't want to provoke whatever it was. Bears do climb trees sometimes, I told myself, but this didn't feel like that. I could hear the leaves crunching softly, like careful, deliberate steps. My hands gripped the sides of the bench. I could taste the coppery tang of my own fear in my mouth. Minutes passed, or maybe only seconds. Time felt wrong, stretched out. The shape in the tree remained still after a little movement, almost as if it were watching me back. My mind raced through possibilities: an animal, a prankster, someone lost. None of it made sense, none of it felt right. Finally, I built up whatever courage I had left and pointed the flashlight straight at the tree. The beam landed, and my stomach dropped in a way I didn't think was possible. There, crouched in the branches, was a man. A human being, but not moving like a person should. He was hunched over, his limbs bent in unnatural angles, crouched as if he had been waiting for me to notice. His eyes were wide and unblinking, staring directly at me. There was no expression, just the intensity of those eyes, and they felt like they were cutting through every part of me. The beam caught him for a moment, and he shifted slightly, like he might come down from the tree. I didn't wait to see. Every instinct screamed at me to move. I leaped from the bench, my legs pumping as fast as they could carry me. I ran through the small path that led back to my house, hearing the dry crack of twigs under my feet, trying not to look back. My heart felt like it would burst through my chest. When I reached my backyard, I slammed the door behind me and locked it. Every part of me was shaking. I checked all the doors and windows, checked the locks, even went up to the attic to make sure there was no one there. I didn't know why I did all that, but I couldn't stop thinking about those eyes and the way he had just stayed there, silent, watching me. I called the police. They came, did a sweep of the area, and found nothing. No sign of anyone near the pond or in the trees. Nothing. It was as if he had disappeared into the darkness completely. I tried to convince myself I had imagined it. That fear had played tricks on me. But I knew better. I felt the memory of him crouched in the branches, in every part of my body for weeks afterward. For months, I didn't walk anywhere alone at night. Even when I was just going to the corner store, I took precautions. I carried a small pocket knife, sometimes pepper spray, and kept my phone in my hand. I never looked at that path near the pond again without a heavy sense of dread. Eventually, the fear softened into caution. I learned the neighborhood better, knew which streets were quiet at night, which areas to avoid. I never saw him again. There were no reports of anyone climbing trees, no break-ins, no animal attacks. Just the memory. And the knowledge that someone had been out there, silent, waiting, watching. I still walk near the pond sometimes during the day. The bench is still there. The rope swing still hangs over the water. But the area doesn't feel inviting anymore. It feels like a place you should leave alone, a place that remembers your presence long after you leave. I make sure I never linger. And I always keep my distance from the trees. I never go out alone at night anymore. The night taught me something simple, but important: fear is real, and some dangers are invisible until it's almost too late. I've learned to respect that, to stay aware, and to never underestimate the quiet in the woods. You can walk a familiar path, and still, something can be waiting where you thought nothing was. I never forgot that man in the tree, crouched and silent, and I never will. I always thought I knew that park better than anyone. I had been going there since I was a kid, and by the time my friends and I started playing manhunt there almost every weekend, it felt like a second home. We knew every trail, every hiding spot behind the trees, every bench, every corner where the shadows stayed darker than the rest of the field lights. The park was huge, built around a long hill with a pavilion on top, and a long stairwell running down one side like a spine. At night it always felt bigger than it did during the day. The air cooled fast after sunset, and the trees made quiet rustling sounds that you never noticed when families were around during the afternoon. But during those nights, when it was just us, it felt like a place made for the game. One night we had a big group, way larger than normal. Everyone was running around, spreading out into the dark just before the game started. A few of us got picked to be it first. It was me, my buddy, and his younger brother. We had done this 100 times and knew the drill. Wait a minute or two, then move toward the areas people liked hiding in. Most of the time people chose the same spots out of habit. The thick trees near the hill, the benches near the far side of the playground, the big open field behind the pavilion. But the most common place people liked to hide was the stairwell hill, because the steps went down so far and had so many turn points where you could duck behind bushes. We headed up the stairs first, then slowly started walking down, trying to listen for any movement. The night was quiet, except for our feet on the old cement steps. Everything had that strange mix of cool air and leftover heat from the day. The sky above was clear, and the moon gave off enough light that we didn't need to use the flashlights on our phones. We always avoided using lights, because they gave away your position. We were halfway down the stairs when we noticed movement far below us. Two figures were standing near the bottom, almost blending into the shadows. I thought it was one of our friends at first. It was normal to catch someone standing still, trying not to get caught. We always gave each other a warning call before sprinting to tag them, and normally the others would yell their name back, and then take off running. But something felt off even before anything happened. The two shapes didn't move like our friends usually did. They were just standing there in a way that made my stomach tighten a little. There was something stiff about the way they held themselves. For a second we hesitated, and I remember thinking the whole thing felt strange. But we were used to weird moments during the game, so we brushed it off and started to move down a little faster. Normally that would make whoever was hiding bolt off into the dark, but these two didn't. I felt a weird tension in the air. Then we shouted out like we always did, expecting a familiar reaction. Instead, everything changed at once. The two figures didn't freeze, didn't laugh, didn't run the other way. They suddenly sprinted straight toward us. Not jogging, not stumbling. Full speed. Like they had been waiting to do exactly that. For a moment none of us understood what we were seeing. And then something cold shot through my chest. We spun around and ran back up the stairs as fast as we could. The steps were long and wide, built in a way that made them slow to climb even when you weren't terrified. I could hear my breathing speed up right away, and I could feel the burn in my legs almost instantly. My friend was ahead of me, his younger brother behind me. The sound of feet slamming the concrete behind us made everything feel unreal. I had played this game for years, and had never felt fear like that. When we reached the top of the hill, we stopped for just a second to catch our breath. I turned around. They were almost right on top of us. 10 feet away at most. It didn't make any sense. We had been so far above them when we turned around, and the stairs took forever to climb. No one should have been able to close that distance that fast, especially in the dark. That was the first moment I felt something close to real panic. We tore off across the top of the hill, heading for the outer trail that wrapped around the whole park. That trail eventually led to a residential road where one of our friends lived. It was our usual meet-up point when a round ended, or if anything got confusing. The problem was that the trail was long, and the point where we entered it was about 2 miles away from the street. Normally running that distance would be exhausting but manageable. That night it felt impossible. The air felt colder as we ran, or maybe that was just the adrenaline. Every time I risked looking back, I saw the shape of the 2 people behind us. They never stopped, never slowed down. They weren't yelling. They weren't trying to hide. They were just chasing us, steady and fast. I kept wondering who the hell they were, and why they were there that late in the park. There were no homes close to that part of the park. No parking lot nearby. No reason anyone would be walking around at that time, unless they were part of our group, or doing something they didn't want anyone else to see. The trail curved through thick trees. There were long stretches of darkness, where the branches above blocked out most of the moonlight. Every time we entered one of those dim spots, I felt like something was about to grab me from behind. My legs were burning so badly that I thought I was going to collapse. But the fear kept pushing me forward. We ran past the small creek that cut under the trail and past the old picnic tables where we used to hide during earlier games. Every familiar spot now looked different, like everything had changed just because 2 strangers decided to sprint after us. My mind kept cycling through what could possibly be going on. Maybe they were drunk. Maybe they were high. Maybe they were just messing around. But nothing about their speed or the way they ran felt normal. They weren't stumbling or shouting or showing any sign of confusion. They were silent and direct. My friend's younger brother started slowing down, and I could hear him gasping for air. We practically dragged him along the path at some points. The pounding of feet behind us never went away. It stayed the same distance the entire time, which somehow made it even worse than hearing it get closer. When we were maybe a quarter mile from the street, something changed. The sound of the footsteps stopped. I didn't notice at first because my pulse was so loud in my ears. But after a few seconds of silence, I slowed down and looked behind us. The path was empty. The trees were still. The trail bent behind us, and there was no sign of movement. The 2 people were gone, as if they simply vanished into the dark. I didn't trust the silence at all. None of us did. We didn't stop moving. We pushed ourselves until we hit the last corner of the trail and saw the streetlights ahead. When we finally reached the road, the fear didn't drop right away. My chest was tight, my legs shaking so hard that I could barely stand still. We walked down the street until we reached the driveway where our friends usually waited between rounds. Sure enough, everyone was already there, lounging around like they had been hanging out for a long time. They had decided to prank us that night, going back to the house to wait instead of hiding in the park. They had no idea what happened, and none of them had seen the 2 strangers. Some of them laughed when we told them what happened. Some didn't believe a word. A couple of them suggested going back to check. But none of us who had been chased wanted to step foot back in the park that night. The look in those strangers' faces wasn't something I could easily explain, but it burned into my mind. They weren't lost. They weren't confused. They weren't playing a joke. They were chasing us on purpose. I went home later that night, and even though my family was asleep, I walked through the house turning on lights and locking every door twice. I couldn't get the image of those 2 figures sprinting up the stairs out of my mind. The speed, the silence, the way they came out of nowhere. I never found out who they were, and none of us ever saw them again. But that was the last night I ever played manhunt in that park. I realized that even in a place you think you know by heart, there are parts that can change in a second. And some people who show up in the dark don't need a reason to chase you. They just do, And the worst part is knowing that they were real. Not shadows, not tricks of the dark. Real people who decided to run at us without hesitation, faster than any of us could explain. And knowing they disappeared just as fast still makes my skin crawl whenever I think about that stairwell and the long trail behind it. I still remember the smell of the mud before anything else, thick and wet and heavy, like it had been waiting all day for a group of idiots to roll through just so it could trap one of the cars. It clung to everything, our tires, our shoes, our hands, even the metal of the doors when we pushed and pulled and cursed under our breath. It was late at night, and the weak light from the car's headlights was cutting a dull yellow path across the dirt road. I kept thinking about how quiet the woods were. I could hear the engine idling and our shoes sinking into the ground, but nothing else. It was around the time when you expect the temperature to drop fast, when the dark settles in completely, and the only real comfort you have is noise, and we didn't have much of that. We had come to this lake a bunch of times in the daytime, but being there at night was a different thing. There was a barricade across the entrance, one of those metal ones that the park rangers set up when they didn't want people driving in, but everyone in the group decided that we didn't care. We drove around it through the open space where the grass had thinned out. The ground underneath the grass was soft and uneven, and we didn't stop to think that maybe there was a reason the barricade was still there. We were too focused on the idea of a late night by the water, the fire, the alcohol, the way the lake always reflected the sky. The car behind us got caught almost immediately. Its front tires spun in place and kicked up mud in thick lines that hit the side of the car and the legs of the people standing near it. I stood back for a moment and looked at the trees around us. They looked taller than usual, and with the headlights shining from behind them, it made them look like silhouettes with no real detail. I made a joke about how it felt like the start of a horror movie. In my head it felt funny, because everything about the scene lined up with those moments you see right before things go wrong. Everyone laughed, but the sound was thin and quick, the kind of laugh people use when they want things to feel lighter than they actually are. The mud kept us busy, though. That was the thing with nights like this. If you keep your hands full long enough, you can push whatever uneasy feeling you have into the back of your mind. When the tires finally caught and the car lurched forward, we all breathed out at the same time. The mud had splattered across the windshield, and we wiped it down with a shirt someone had thrown in the trunk. The whole process made us sweaty and tired, and I could feel the cold air hitting the back of my neck when we finally climbed into the cars again. The path to the lake was rough and narrow, like it had been carved out a long time ago and never fixed. Low-hanging branches brushed against the windows. The headlights barely lit the ground ahead. It felt like driving into a place we weren't supposed to be. But when we got to the clearing by the lake, everything changed instantly. The trees opened up and the ground flattened out. The air felt wider. The lake was dark, but the surface was smooth and still, reflecting only a thin sliver of the moon. We unloaded everything fast, like the fun could only start once we had the fire going. Someone knew how to stack the logs right, and within minutes the flames were rising high enough to push back the cold. Music came from someone's speaker, low and steady, getting absorbed by the open space and the water. People started to relax. The smell of smoke mixed with the smell of the lake. I felt the tension in my shoulders loosen. I sat on one of the old logs near the fire and watched the sparks drift upward. It was the kind of night where you feel like time is stretching. Everyone was talking, taking turns standing up and moving around, grabbing drinks, adjusting their jackets, poking at the fire. The light from the flames kept shifting across the surrounding trees, and once in a while I caught myself staring into the darkness beyond them, squinting to see if anything was out there. I told myself I was just being paranoid because of my earlier joke. I had watched too many movies. That was what everyone always told me. The first moment I felt something was wrong came before anything even happened. It was a small shift in the air, like the temperature suddenly dipped just a bit, or like there was movement behind me that I couldn't see. I turned around and looked at the tree line again. Nothing, just darkness and shapes. I tried to ignore it and grabbed another drink from the cooler. Inside the cooler, buried under the ice and bottles, there was a hatchet someone had brought earlier in the night. It was mostly for splitting firewood, but the moment I saw it I felt something tighten in my gut. I didn't like that it was just lying there, half buried. Without thinking I took it and held onto it. The handle felt cold and rough, but the weight made me feel more grounded. I sat back down, watching the fire, and that was when I noticed him. He walked out of the trees like he had been standing there the whole time. He wasn't stumbling or rushing. He moved slowly, like he was comfortable in the dark. He had a beer in his hand, and he lifted it slightly as if to show he was already part of the night. I felt my stomach drop. Something about seeing a stranger appear from a direction none of us had come from made every alarm bell in my head go off. The others didn't react the same way. They waved him over, half drunk and friendly, treating him like he was just another person enjoying the lake at night. Maybe in any other situation he would have been. But something about this moment didn't fit. He sat near me, not close enough to touch me, but close enough that I could feel the energy coming off him. I didn't like how comfortable he looked. I didn't like the calm way he held his beer, or the way he studied the fire. The night didn't feel steady anymore. I kept the hatchet resting against my leg, hidden between the log and my knee. The fire made everything bright on one side and dark on the other, and the flickering shadows made his face hard to read. I noticed the way he looked at people when they were distracted. He wasn't loud or excited. He seemed completely sober, which only made it stranger that he was out there walking alone in the woods with a drink in his hand. He kept making comments, not loud ones, just enough that the people closest to him laughed them off. But every time he said something, my nerves tightened. It was like he was testing reactions. He kept focusing on me for some reason, like he knew I was watching him carefully. I felt like he was slowly tracking where my attention went. At one point I got up and moved around to the other side of the fire. I wanted distance. I told myself I just needed to cool off, to not sit there feeling like I was waiting for something to happen. I put the hatchet on the ground next to me, where I could reach it quickly. I tried to enjoy the moment again. The others were relaxed, still talking, still drinking. The music kept playing and the fire kept crackling. The lake was the same calm surface as before. But the woods behind him stayed dark and quiet. After a while I noticed he was talking again, and the people near him were reacting the same way as before, brushing everything off like he was just being weird. I watched his shoulders, his hands, the angle of his head. The uneasiness in my chest kept getting worse. I reached down to grab the hatchet without looking directly at it. My fingers brushed the dirt. Nothing was there. My heart thudded hard enough that I felt it in my throat. I tried to keep my face neutral, but inside everything locked up. I looked around slowly, pretending I was just scanning the fire. My eyes moved across the flames, across the people, across the space behind me. Then I noticed him. He was looking straight at me through the fire. The flames lit half his face and left the other half in shadow. I saw the way he lifted his hand slightly. The shape of the hatchet handle caught the firelight for a split second. He wasn't even trying to hide it. He knew exactly what he had taken. I felt a cold rush move through my whole body. My brain went into that state where everything feels sharpened and slowed at the same time. I got up. I didn't care how it looked or who thought I was being dramatic. I couldn't unsee what he had done. I couldn't pretend it meant nothing. I kept my breathing steady and walked toward one of my friends, staying close to the cooler and close to the path leading back to the cars. I wanted distance between myself and that stranger, and I wanted space to move if I had to. I remember the way the firelight shifted across the ground as I walked. I remember looking down and noticing how the dirt changed from soft near the lake to firmer near the trees. Every step felt too loud. In my head, I kept thinking about all the times I had seen scenes like this in movies, all the warning signs people ignore, all the moments where someone says later that they felt something was wrong but didn't act on it. I wasn't going to be that person. I leaned toward my friend, made it clear that I was leaving whether anyone else wanted to or not. The look on their face changed instantly, like they finally registered how serious I was. We headed toward the cars without making any kind of scene. I didn't look back at the fire until I was near the trees. When I finally turned, the stranger was still there, still standing, still holding the hatchet. He didn't move. He didn't call out. He didn't follow. He just watched. The walk back to the cars felt too long. Without the firelight, the woods were darker than before, and the path was rough under our feet. I kept checking over my shoulder, expecting to see movement, expecting to hear footsteps, expecting something to snap behind us. But nothing happened. The only sounds were the crunching of leaves and the distant crackling of the fire fading behind us. I could feel adrenaline pushing through me, even after we reached the car. My hands were shaking when I opened the door. I didn't calm down until we were already driving away. And even then my body didn't trust the quiet. The next day everyone acted like it was nothing. They told the story like it was some weird moment at a party. They said the guy hung out for a while, and then walked off into the woods again, disappearing the same way he appeared. They said that nothing else happened after we left. But none of that mattered to me. I kept thinking about how easily things could have gone differently. A hatchet disappearing is never nothing. A stranger walking out of the woods at midnight is never nothing. The way he watched me through the fire wasn't nothing. It didn't matter that the night didn't end with a scream or a struggle or anyone getting hurt. What mattered was the feeling, the instinct. I trusted it. I got out before anything could happen, and even if nothing was ever going to happen, I would make the same choice again. I learned something important that night. Not every danger shows itself. Not every threat is loud. Sometimes it's just a quiet shift in the air, a stranger stepping out of the dark, or the sudden absence of an object you were holding on to for safety. Sometimes the smartest thing you can do is leave when everyone else is still laughing and drinking, and pretending everything is fine. Because sometimes the difference between a normal night and a nightmare is one single decision. And that night, I made the right one. I remember how quiet it was when my wife and I finally reached the trailhead in central Maine. It was close to 2 in the morning, and the storm system we had driven through all day had only just started to move off. The clouds were still hanging low, heavy and broken, like they were confused about whether to keep dumping rain or drift away. The forest around the lot was soaked and dark in a way that felt almost solid, the kind of darkness that eats everything around it. We were both tired, too tired to do anything besides shut off the car and agree that we would sleep a little before starting the long hike in the morning. The air was cool, wet, and still, and the only sound was the steady ticking of the car engine cooling down. I shifted around in the seat for a while, trying to settle into a position that didn't make my legs go numb. The windshield was smeared with leftover water that the wipers had pushed aside earlier. I watched small beads of moisture slide down the glass, moving slow and lazy. I kept listening to the forest, waiting for something recognizable, but the woods here were different from the places I was used to. There were no houses, no distant traffic, no planes, nothing at all. The 100-mile wilderness had its name for a reason. It felt like the middle of nowhere because it was. After a few minutes of trying to get comfortable, I leaned my head against the window. When I did, I noticed a blinking light way off on a distant ridge. It stood out instantly. The forest was pitch black in every direction, except for the faint reflection of our own dashboard lights. So anything brighter than starlight pushed itself forward like a beacon. The blinking was slow, steady, spaced far apart like a tower light. I had seen plenty of radio towers growing up in rural places, and the rhythm was familiar. I didn't think much of it at first. It made sense that the region would have one tower somewhere out there, even in such a remote stretch. The light blinked again, the same slow pulse. The ridge it sat on was maybe 2 miles away, maybe a bit more, but distance in darkness is hard to judge. I let my eyes settle on it while trying to relax. The rest of the mountains around us were just black shapes pressed into darker black shapes. My wife noticed it too and looked at it for a while. It was something to focus on in a place so empty. But after a little while, I started to notice something different about it. The blinking wasn't staying in one place. At first, I thought maybe my eyes were tired and drifting, but it didn't take long to realize that the light actually was shifting down the ridge. It was slow at first, subtle enough that I couldn't tell if it was tree branches moving or the light moving. But the more I stared, the more clear it became that it was traveling downhill. It was strange. It moved in a steady line, not jerky or uneven like a person walking down a trail. It didn't sway the way a flashlight does when somebody hikes down an incline. It just moved in this slow, controlled descent, blinking at the same steady rhythm. I kept watching it, trying to think of a reason why someone would hike at 2 in the morning, right after a massive storm, in one of the most isolated parts of the state. The trail systems around here were rugged, steep, and full of mud and roots. Even with a headlamp, it would be easy to slip, and the blinking pattern didn't match a headlamp beam being blocked by trees. It didn't move sideways at all, only down, like it was following some invisible straight track down the mountain. The slow descent continued, and it held my attention in a way I didn't expect. There was something unnatural about the steadiness of it, even though I forced myself to think of ordinary explanations. I tried to picture someone making their way down the ridge, maybe a through hiker pushing through the night, or somebody doing trail work who got caught by the storm. But it still didn't feel right. Nobody would choose this hour unless they had no choice. I remember the moment it sped up. One blink it was halfway down the slope, then the next blink it was noticeably lower, then lower again. It went from slow, deliberate movement to something that covered huge sections of the hillside in almost no time. I could feel my stomach tighten, because even though I didn't want to jump to conclusions, nothing I knew could explain that kind of movement. It wasn't skittering or weaving or bobbing. It stayed level, almost smooth in its path, dropping down the mountainside like it wasn't affected by the terrain at all. I don't know how long we had turned off the car lights before this happened, but when the thing got closer, the darkness around us felt bigger and heavier. Eventually we switched the headlights back on. The bright white beams cut through the trees near the trailhead and lit up the small gravel lot, but the forest beyond remained untouched, as if the light couldn't stretch past the edge of the trees. The mountain ridge with the blinking light was still out of reach of our headlights, but I could see the light clearer now that my eyes had adjusted somewhat. It kept getting closer. At first it was just a distant dot that blinked at a calm pace. Then it was at the base of the ridge. Then it was moving through the lower trees, coming in a straight line toward us, blinking in the same slow, controlled pattern. The speed wasn't like anything I'd seen before. It crossed what had to be a couple miles in maybe a minute or two, at most. It didn't bounce, didn't react to the uneven ground, didn't pause. It just came. My chest tightened. I wasn't seeing shapes or ghosts or any made-up thing. It was just a light, but a light moving in a way that didn't make sense. The fear grew from how little there was to latch onto. Fear gets worse when there's no form to it. When it reached the trees on the far end of the parking area, it stopped. It hung there, maybe 20 feet above the ground, blinking in the exact same slow pattern. The brightness was strange. It wasn't strong enough to cast shadows or light up the trees, but it wasn't faint either. It looked like a dim street lamp with no pole, suspended in midair. I couldn't make out anything around it. No outline, no body, no shape explaining what the light belonged to. Just the light itself, cutting in and out, steady and calm. I grabbed the flashlight we had in the glove box. It wasn't a cheap one. It was bright enough to light up a whole section of forest when we used it on normal hikes. I stepped out of the car with the door cracked open, pointing the beam directly at the blinking light. The flashlight lit up every tree trunk, branch, and patch of ground between me and the light, but it didn't reveal anything beyond that. The light hung in the air, blinking exactly the same way, unaffected by the flashlight beam. Nothing reflected. Nothing changed. It looked like it wasn't even part of the space I was standing in. The air felt heavier with every blink. I kept waiting for something to happen, something to break the tension. But nothing moved. Nothing changed. It just blinked, faint but sharp, like it had no purpose other than to be watched. The night was cold enough that I could feel the dampness seeping into my clothes. The mud under my shoes was soft and slick. The smell of wet pine needles and soaked soil was strong. Everything around me was tangible and real, yet that light seemed separate from all of it. Minutes passed. I kept expecting the light to drift away or move back up the ridge or fade. Instead it hung there, absolutely still except for the blinking. 20 minutes felt like an hour. My eyes began to sting from staring so long. Every part of my mind was trying to place it into some category, some known thing. A drone, a reflection, a firefly, something mechanical, something natural. But nothing matched the speed, the distance it covered, the steadiness of the blinking, or the way it hovered without any movement at all. I kept thinking about insects, because those at least move fast. But I had lived in plenty of rural places and seen fireflies by the thousands. None of them were bright enough to be seen clearly from miles away. None of them moved in perfectly straight lines down mountains. None of them hovered at a fixed height without drifting. And none of them disappeared in the way this one finally did. One moment it was there. The next blink never came. I didn't see it shoot away or fade or drop. It simply wasn't there anymore. The space where it had floated was just empty darkness, quiet and soft and unchanged. There was no sound, no rush of air, no movement. It was as if someone had turned off a switch. I stood still for a long time, staring at the same spot, waiting for even a single flash to return. Nothing happened. The forest looked exactly as it did before. The air felt the same. The headlights lit up the same trees. The rainwater still ran in tiny streams across the gravel. But the light was gone. When I finally sat back in the car, the adrenaline drained from my body slowly. The tiredness came back in full force, and the quiet around us felt heavier now that the light wasn't there to focus on. My mind kept trying to build explanations and tear them down. I didn't want anything supernatural. I didn't believe in anything outside the ordinary world. But there was nothing ordinary about what I saw. It was just a light, and yet it wasn't like anything I had ever encountered before. I didn't sleep well for the rest of the night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the light coming down the ridge again, moving in that straight, controlled path. I wasn't scared of ghosts or creatures or anything like that. I was scared of the fact that something had crossed miles of dark wilderness with a calm, precise rhythm, stopped above the trees near us, hovered for 20 minutes, and vanished without leaving anything behind. I couldn't explain it, and that bothered me more than anything. In the morning, the forest looked normal again. The sunlight made the trailhead feel harmless and open. The trees seemed thinner, the air fresher. It was easy to pretend the night before hadn't happened. But as we started hiking into the wilderness, I kept glancing back at that same ridge. In daylight, it was just another forested slope. No tower, no structure, nothing at all. I tried to picture the blinking light in that same spot, floating above the ground. Every time I imagined it, I felt the same pressure in my chest that I felt during the night. Years later, I still don't know what it was. I've tried to come up with every possible explanation that fits within the real world. A drone would have made noise and couldn't have been seen from so far away. A firefly couldn't be that bright or move in such a long, straight path. A person couldn't travel that distance so fast or hover. A reflection doesn't move down mountains. I keep landing on the idea that it was some kind of insect or natural phenomenon that I had never seen before, something rare or unusual. It's the only explanation that doesn't drift into impossible territory. But even now, when I think about the way it descended the ridge, the speed it gained, the stillness when it hovered, and the way it vanished without movement, it still feels wrong. Real, but wrong. Something that existed for those 20 minutes and then never existed again. The ending I hold on to is simple. It happened. It was real. It didn't harm us. It didn't follow us. It didn't return. It was something I cannot explain with the knowledge I have, but it didn't change the world around me. The wilderness went back to being quiet and empty. The trail was the same. The mountains were the same. The forest was still thick and lonely and wet from the storms. The light came down the ridge, hovered, and disappeared. And all I'm left with is the memory of it, sharp and clear. Something I will always remember but never fully understand. I remember the hike clearly, even years later. It was during my high school days. A few friends and I decided to do an overnight trip in the Rockies behind our small town. The plan was simple enough: drive up, find a secluded spot, set up camp, and spend the night in the wilderness. The drive itself was long, winding through narrow roads and steep cliffs, but we were excited. By the time we reached the trailhead, it was already past 2 in the morning. Exhausted and hungry, we decided to catch a few hours of sleep in the car before starting the hike at first light. The air was cold crisp, and the sky was dotted with stars. No other cars were around, no distant lights, just the quiet of the Rockies pressing in on every side. We set out around sunrise, backpacks heavy with gear, food, and emergency supplies. The trail quickly became rugged, rocks jutting out, roots snaking across the path, and occasional patches of mud that threatened to swallow our boots. The further we climbed, the thinner the forest grew, the air sharper and colder. We moved slower than expected, pausing often to catch our breath and admire the view from the occasional clearings. By late afternoon, we found a small grove of trees that offered a natural shelter. It was sheltered from the wind, the dense trees blocking any harsh weather that might have rolled in, and the ground was relatively flat, a small clearing just enough for our tents and a fire. We set up camp quickly, gathering dry wood and building a small fire pit. The flames licked upward, casting warm light on our tired faces and dancing shadows across the trees. We cooked a simple dinner, eating quietly while the sun dipped behind the peaks. Night fell fast in those mountains, and soon we were sitting around the fire, talking and laughing quietly, the only sounds being our voices, the crackle of flames, and the distant rustling of small animals in the underbrush. It felt isolated, completely cut off from the world, and it was thrilling in a way only teenagers could find thrilling. Then it happened. Without warning, one of my friends leapt forward and dumped our emergency water all over the fire. In seconds, the flames sputtered and died, leaving us in near total darkness. The sudden change shocked us, and anger bubbled up immediately. There was no reason to do that, but then we noticed him. He wasn't laughing, joking, or proud of himself. He was frozen, trembling, his eyes wide and staring. He couldn't speak or move, his entire body rigid with fear. Something in him was so raw and immediate that it forced the rest of us to pause, our anger forgotten. After a few tense seconds, we managed to get a glimpse of what had him so terrified. On the ridge above us, far enough away that it was hard to make out details at first, a fire was burning. Not small, not a campfire, but a massive bonfire, like something built for a gathering. Around it were figures moving slowly in a circle. They looked humanoid, but something about them was wrong. Their arms and legs were thin, disproportionately long, or at least they looked that way in the low light. They didn't run, jump, or shout. They simply moved in a slow, steady rotation around the fire, endlessly, rhythmically. One of my friends thought he could hear a faint, muffled sound, like singing, but I couldn't make anything out. The fire illuminated them, casting long, unnatural shadows across the ridge, the smoke curling up and blurring the shapes. Off to the side, another figure stood alone, leaning casually against a tree branch, arm above its head, completely still. The way it leaned, the height it implied, made my stomach twist. Even from our distance, it seemed impossibly tall, far taller than any normal human. We froze, unsure if we should move or stay put. Eventually, the fear ebbed enough that we convinced ourselves it was probably just a scout troop, or some other hikers playing a prank. We tried to go to sleep, huddled in our tents, but it was impossible to shake the image of those figures, circling endlessly, and that one figure standing alone, unnervingly still. The forest, once comforting, now felt oppressive. Every rustle of leaves, every distant snap of a twig made us jump. I don't think any of us slept more than a few fitful hours that night. Morning came slow, gray light filtering through the treetops. We packed up, still uneasy, and made our way to the ridge where we had seen the figures. The closer we got, the more we could see the evidence of human, or at least humanoid, activity. The fire pit was still smoldering in spots, remnants of charred wood scattered around. Footprints crisscrossed the clearing, some larger than others. In the center of the fire pit was a small mound of burned animal bones, probably rodents. Next to it, a neat pile of 4 or 5 small skulls had been burned but left intact, their empty eye sockets staring upward. The image was grotesque, clinical in a way that made it even creepier. Nothing about it suggested anything innocent. We walked over to the spot where the lone figure had leaned against the tree. At first glance, it looked empty. But then we noticed something dark on the ground, blood. Not a massive amount, just a smear, enough to suggest that someone or something had been injured. And the branch itself, far above my head, clearly implied the figure who had leaned on it was at least 7 feet tall. None of us were under any illusions now. These weren't kids playing a prank. These were large, deliberate figures moving in a way that made no sense, leaving behind clear signs that someone, or something, had been there and had interacted with the environment in a purposeful, almost ritualistic way. The 4 of us didn't speak much as we packed up and made our way down. The forest felt different in daylight, the shadows less intimidating, the danger less immediate, but the evidence of the previous night remained. We moved faster than we had on the ascent, our backpacks digging into sore shoulders, our legs aching from the climb, but adrenaline kept us going. By the time we reached the bottom, I don't think any of us looked back. The mountains had never felt so heavy, so watchful. After we got home, we called the local fish and wildlife rangers and reported what we had seen. They dismissed it quickly, suggesting it was probably kids messing around or hikers making a large fire for some purpose. But we knew what we saw. None of us could explain the proportions of the figures, the slow, deliberate movement, or the pile of charred animal remains. And though we tried to rationalize it, the memory of that night stayed with each of us, lingering in the corners of our minds. I've never returned to that section of the Rockies. I don't need to. The image of those figures circling the fire, the lone figure standing impossibly tall against the tree, the small mound of charred skulls and bones, all of it is etched into my memory. The mountains, which had always been a place of freedom and adventure, became a place of caution and unease. We hike, we explore, we push our limits, but there are some places, some experiences, that remind you how small and unprepared you are, and those memories last a lifetime. That hike taught me that lesson, and even years later, I can feel the tight knot in my stomach just thinking about the ridge, the fire, and those figures moving silently in the night. The Rockies can be beautiful, but they are also a place where nature and humanity meet in ways that are not always safe, not always understandable, and sometimes not entirely predictable. That's enough for me. I'll never go back. The memory is clear, and the lesson is clear. There is beauty in the mountains, but there is also the unknown, and sometimes the unknown is better left unexplored. Our hike ended without anyone hurt physically, but the psychological imprint remains. The fear, the uncertainty, the quiet terror of seeing something that should not exist in our understanding of the world. Those things don't fade with distance or time. They stay with you, quiet but persistent. The mountains behind our town may look peaceful from a distance, but I know what can hide in the darkness, what can move silently in the shadows, and I know now to respect that. We came for adventure, for the thrill of the wilderness, and we found it, but in a way that was far beyond anything we had anticipated. I learned that night that some experiences are meant to be remembered, not repeated, and the Rockies behind our town are one of them.